Hey everybody, welcome to episode 50 of the Re-Federalist Report. I am Brady, also known in some strange corners of the internet as Warhamster. Co-hosting with me today is my good friend, constitutional mentor, Mr. Constitution himself, Douglas V. Gibbs. It's been 3 months, Doug.
Well, you have to wait for when you have to wait for episode 50, you have to, create the suspense,
Yeah, when we last left off, Doug and I, it was right before Thanksgiving, Doug and I talked about starting to try to maybe do 2 of these episodes a week. And next thing you know I got a fractured hip and a pinched nerve in my neck, and Doug's got a neck problem. And, well, it looks like we're back in both in one piece again, and it's time to get back in the swing of things.
Yeah, I can actually tilt my neck and everything now again, so I'm good.
It's liberating.
I've had those issues for a very long time, so it happens occasionally, but I'm glad to be here, glad to be back on the channel, looking forward to continuing on. And, as always, there's always a lot going on, but we are in a new year, and so let's move forward with this.
All right. Well, when we left off, we were reviewing Madison's notes, and we've been going through it pretty much on a day-by-day basis, as the founders themselves did, going through it word for word. And the reason we're doing this is because if we're going to talk about original intent, that'd be a pretty good idea to figure out exactly what the founders, the framers, actually were thinking this whole time.
And for the purpose of informing the viewers, listeners here, I've been a constitutionalist all my life, but I really gained a full understanding of what I believed and what I was learning about the founders and the Constitution and original intent when I studied Madison's notes. And, I'm sure Warhamster here remembers when I used to teach my classes. That was one of the things I would tell my classes. That was one of the greatest influences on my understanding of original intent was Madison's notes. So I've been totally enjoying this. I've been through Madison's notes before, but the reason why this has been even more rewarding for me is because while I have gone through Madison's notes a few times, one time with a friend of mine who went by the handle Loki online, this first time I've had a chance to do it with somebody else. And I have to now say about Warhamster is he's one of the best researchers I know. So not only am I getting the opportunity to go through Madison's notes again, but I'm learning along the way because he's picking up on things I went, yeah, I didn't see that last time. So, folks, you're in for a pretty thorough digestion of original intent through this exercise.
Very good. This is actually this will be the 18th episode of Madison's notes. You can see we're going day by day. This is the calendar from 1787. We last left off on Wednesday, June 20th. And the debate, first of all, we were going through our anti-hero, Alexander Hamilton, and his crazy proposals to turn us into a limited monarchy, what have you.
Yeah, but, if it wasn't for some of his craziness, some of the good stuff might not have happened. So, and every once in a while, even he nailed it. And let me say this real quick, because I just had a conversation about Alexander Hamilton last night with my wife. Because she asked me what, the difference between a democracy and a republic is again. And of course, Hamilton came into the conversation. And here's the thing about Hamilton that's fascinating. And I tell you this, listeners, as a warning. Hamilton was smooth operator when it came to his language. And he knew what he believed, but he knew what you wanted to hear. And I mean, Americans at his time. And so he knew how to word things in just the way that it sounded good. It may even have sounded like he believed in true federalism when really he was a nationalist. So when we go through these debates and you hear Hamilton's voice here, or us reading what he had to say, understand he is a big government guy, but he tempered it quite a bit because he understood it's a little too radical for most people. Now, that also said, when we went into the debate, very beginning, way back in May. So look, we're in June. We're in June now. When it comes to the debates, they were all nationalists going in, but as they tried to apply national ideas, but understood they had to keep it limited, what the states wanted, what the states expected, you really enjoy watching a lot of these guys kind of transform into something different. They begin to understand, and we've talked about this on this program. So once again, I want you always keep this in mind. One of the questions that was always on the floor was, would the states approve this? So that also tempered it.
And that's exactly where we left off. The big debate on here right now is whether there should be a federal negative of state powers.
Mm-hmm.
They're still going back and forth. They've got a lot of things resolved.
Madison going in believed, and Madison going into this, his original writing of the Virginia plan actually had a negative of state law by Congress in it. He changed his mind by the end of the convention. But anyway, go ahead. Sorry about that.
Well, now basically what they're saying is, should the federal government be supreme over the states? And this is what they're debating. And John Lansing of New York, who's the last person we listened to, and he had a beautiful, very long paragraph. And he's talking about whether the states will ratify it to, giving up so much power.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about, will a gentleman from Georgia be the judge of how a law is to operate in New Hampshire? Such a negative would be more injurious than that of Great Britain heretofore was. It is said that a national government must have the influence arising from the grant of offices and honors. It's basically saying the states are never going to agree to this, so don't try to do it. If this influence is to be attained, the states must be entirely abolished. Would that ever be agreed to?
Now, understand for a second, listeners, real quick. They are coming out of a system. They're trying to fix a system where the states have all the power. So this isn't just suddenly they're having this idea of state sovereignty. The states are already used to taking care of their own business. All right, go ahead.
Okay, so the next person to speak on this subject is going to be George Mason, Colonel Mason. He is one of the heroes, probably the most important or the inspiration for the anti-federalists, who ended up being right about a lot of things. So, yeah. Jumping in, Mason. He did not expect this point would have to be re-agitated. Talking about the state sovereignty. The essential differences between the two plans, the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan, have been clearly stated. The principal objections against that of Mr. Randolph, that's the Virginia plan, were the want of power and the want of practicability. There can be no weight in the first, as the fiat is not to be there, but in the people. He thought his colleague, Mr. Randolph, that there were, besides certain crises, in which all the ordinary cautions yielded to public necessity. Talking about emergency powers. He gave an example of the eventual treaty with Great Britain, informing which the commanders of the U.S. had boldly disregarded the improvident shackles of Congress. The improvident shackles Congress had given to their country an honorable and happy peace, and instead of being censured for the transgression of their powers, has raised themselves a monument more durable than brass. What's he saying there, Doug?
Well, he's recognizing that we have a system that we came from in which the centralization of power created a problem.
And he said, it goes into that in the next sentence. He says the impracticability of gaining the public concurrence he thought was still more groundless. Mr. Lansing had cited the attempts of Congress to gain an enlargement of their powers and had inferred from the miscarriage of these attempts the hopelessness of the plan which he, Mr. Lansing, he's referring to, opposed.
He's recognizing also that power given becomes power that can expand. You got to remember, Mason here really becomes ultimately the chief leader of the anti-federalists. Not because they hate the Constitution, but because they fear what it will allow. The power can expand. The envelope always gets pushed. And that's what he's explaining here. And it happened with Britain. It can happen here.
Yeah, and he's also pointing out that Congress had tried to get it under the Articles of Confederation to try to give itself more power, and the people pushed back.
Mm-hmm. And it gets back to what we were talking about earlier. Would the states allow this?
All right. Mason, he thought a very different inference ought to have been drawn, that the plan which Mr. L. espoused, Lansing, and which proposed to augment the powers of Congress never could be expected to succeed. He meant not to throw any reflections on Congress as a body, much less on any particular members of it. He meant, however, to speak his sentiments without reserve on this subject. Said it was a privilege of age, and perhaps the only compensation which nature had given for the privation of so many other enjoyments, and he should not scruple to exercise it freely. That's basically flowery talk.
Well, and you got to remember, you have the factions that are saying we need to stick very closely with the Articles of Confederation were. States have all the power. Another faction is saying we won't survive unless the central government has some teeth. And I hate to say it this way, but they were both right. So the issue is beginning to develop here is a realization, and don't get me wrong, Mason's nailing it, but he's not understanding that there's got to be some teeth. You need the lion, but the lion eats people. So what do? And so it comes down to, okay, we need the federal government to be strong on this, but not on this. We need the states to handle their internal issues. We need the federal government to be strong. We want the lion for foreign policy, for trade, for war, or whatever, but we can't allow that lion to be unleashed on the states and on the people, and the people would never allow it. And so this is what's developing through these conversations, this idea that it's dangerous, but it's necessary. So what do we do here?
And the anti-federalists are making the argument that you've given it too much power and the lion is loose and you'll never be able to get back in the cage. And they turned out historically to be correct on a lot of that. Mason says, is it to be thought?
Not because of the Constitution, but because of human nature. So
that's exactly it. They understand human nature. Power corrupts. This is a great sentence here. Is it to be thought that the people of America, so watchful over their interests, so jealous of their liberties, will give up their all, will surrender both the sword and the purse to the same body, and that too not chosen immediately by themselves?
Remember, these guys are, this society are the descendants of the Saxons. The Saxons didn't, they set up the system so that there could not be an aristocracy. There could not be too much central control. The families, the communities had, took care of all. So this is not just, once again, ideas that they're just popping up with. This is ingrained in the history of the British system of liberty. And they knew that the British government had abused it. They had gone far from it. These are guys that had studied not only other systems, but their own system and the beginnings of their own system, which largely came from the Saxons, who believed in limited government, no aristocracy, no one's above the law, including the leader, on and on and on. And so you have now George Mason drawing from those ideas, and also the ideas of what the colonies have been. Go ahead.
And at this time, the colonies were sovereign states in their own right. They have the same rights as any other nation.
Right. They are individual entities from their point of view, sovereign states.
He says the people, they never will give up that. They never should. Will they trust such a body with the regulation of their trade, with the regulation of their taxes, with all the other great powers which are in contemplation? Will they give unbounded confidence to a secret journal, to the intrigues, to the factions which, in the nature of things, appertain to such an assembly?
Factions. Just stop here for a second. Factions. This is so important. They recognize there were so many factions. If you want to use the word ideologies, groups, power struggles, whatever you want to put in there, factions. And one of the problems was factionist behavior was a constant. And we're not just talking left, right, big government, small government. We're talking different religious, rural versus big city, ideas regarding economics, states with large populations versus small populations, territorial factions. It goes on and on and on. And what would typically happen is once a faction began to gain power, it would start to control things, such as human nature. How do you control the factions? Go ahead.
Well, one of the points you said there is the economic factions. And that's something we really ought to keep in mind, because at this point in time and leading into the next century, you're going to have the Eastern Seaboard, and that's a maritime economy. They're about trade, and eventually they get into industrial, manufacturing. The South is an agrarian economy, and the two are in contrast. They're in conflict from day one. Two totally different cultures, and this would lead to the Civil War. The Northern faction decided to take over, the government by winning 41% of the popular vote in 1860, and the South wanted nothing to do with it. And so these economic factions matter probably more than any of the other ones. So,
and they continue to this day, maybe in a different form, maybe in a different slogan, maybe with different names, but it's the same stuff.
Yeah, you could see that throughout the 70s in the Cold War and stuff like that. You'd have this, you had the Yankees and the Cowboys. The Yankees, of course, Eastern Seaboard. The Cowboys were the younger, new money defense military industrial complex, and they would flex their power in D.C. and until the two started working together. So it still exists, very much so. If any man doubts the existence of these characters of Congress, let him consult their journals for the years 1778, 79, and 80, which would be the next few years. It will be said that if people are averse to parting with power, why is it hoped that they will part with it to a national legislature? The proper answer is that in this case, they do not part with power. They only transfer it from one set of immediate representatives to another set. Much has been said of the unsettled state of the mind of the people. He believed the mind of the people of America, as elsewhere, was unsettled as to some points, but settled as do others. Stop there real quick. Talk about the transfer of power, and that's something Doug's hit on quite a bit. The federal government was being granted limited enumerated powers, and that's it. Transferring power from one entity to another is a big deal. They have a tendency not to give it back, so it must be done with quite a bit of care. And he's wondering if the people are going to agree to it.
And ultimately, when it comes down to the Constitution, then the question, usually when people ask me if something is constitutional, my first response is, well, it depends on where the authority lies. That's ultimately what came down to, is where the authorities were placed. Go ahead.
In 2 points, he was sure it was settled. 1, an attachment to Republican government, and 2, an attachment to more than one branch in the legislature. That's the new bicameral proposal.
Yeah, and understand, historically, the bicameral idea seemed right because their studies showed that the most successful legislatures were bicameral, with two houses that were different from each other. And you've heard me say this before. If you're a longtime viewer of this, if you haven't, we go back to Rome, the Roman bicameral system. You had the assembly, which was the voice of the people. You had the Senate, which was the voice of the powerful, the aristocracy. Same thing when it came to Britain, is you've got the House of Lords and the House of Commons. House of Commons being the people, the House of Lords being the aristocracy. But at the same time, we're trying to get away from aristocracy. So we want the bicameral, but we don't want the second house being aristocracy, but it can't be the same as the House of the People. So this is going to become a very important conversation as we move on. Go ahead.
The constitutions accord so generally in both these circumstances that they seem almost to have been preconcerted. This must either have been a miracle or resulted from the genius of the people. The only exceptions to the establishment of 2 branches in the legislatures are the state of Pennsylvania and Congress, and the latter the only single one not chosen by the people themselves. At this point in time, Congress is chosen by the legislatures.
Right.
Who are chosen by the people, which is actually not a terrible setup. because it gets all the money out of politics and we don't have to put up with advertising. What has been the consequences? The people have been constantly averse to giving that body further powers. It was acknowledged by Mr. Patterson that his plan could not be enforced without military coercion. Patterson's from New Jersey. Does he consider the force of this concession? The most jarring elements of nature, fire and water themselves, are not more incompatible than such a mixture of civil liberty and military execution. Will the militia march from one state to another in order to collect the arrears of taxes from the delinquent members of the Republic? Now, this would be put to the test shortly thereafter with the Whiskey Rebellion. So, he's foretelling that.
Yeah.
Will they maintain an army for this purpose? Will not the citizens of the invaded state assist one another till they rise as one man and shake off the Union altogether? Rebellion is the only case in which the military force of the state can be properly exerted against its citizens. Amen to that. And that's been on trial here over the last few years. Talking about the right to call up the militia.
And here's the thing. Once again, they haven't determined yet that there's going to be necessarily a division, a distribution of power yet per se in the way that it would become. But this is a fear of a standing army. This is a fear of the federal government using force. And one of the observations I've made in history, if you don't mind me going through this real quick, is for fear of a standing army, we have created the standing army. Except for now, it's called agencies. Alphabet soup, your IRS, your FBI, your ATF. You have standing armies that aren't standing armies. They're not officially standing armies, but they really are.
Yeah, that's why it was so nice to see the Chevron deference. Supreme Court got that right last year. That was such a big deal. In one point of view, he was struck with horror at the prospect of recurring to this expedient. To punish the non-payment of taxes with death was a severity not yet adopted by the despotism itself. Yet this unexampled cruelty would be mercy compared to a military collection of revenue, in which the bayonet could make no discrimination between the innocent and the guilty. Such a powerful point. He took this, and that's what we have today. They take our money at the point of a bayonet. He took this occasion to repeat that notwithstanding his solitude to establish a national government, he never would agree to abolish the state governments or render them absolutely insignificant.
And this, basically what he's saying is they must be states, not provinces.
Which is the exact opposite of what Hamilton's been trying to do and incorporate all the states under one national government.
Right.
Which we've seen what happens.
So once again, you got two extremes here fighting. Hamilton's like, the state should be nothing more than corporations, meaning provinces. And now you got Mason saying, no. Individual states, this is how they develop. This is what they are. This is what we have, and it's a good system. And the states would never allow the government to have that kind of control. Which do you want? And once again, and I've always been a believer that on certain things we cannot be binary. It can't be one or the other. There's always a third choice, and it usually is some type of integration of the two ideas. Once again, this is what ultimately the Constitution becomes. Go ahead.
He took this occasion to repeat that notwithstanding his solicit. Okay, I already said that. They were as necessary as the general government, and he would be equally careful to preserve them, talking about the states. He was aware of the difficulty of drawing the line between them, but hoped it was not insurmountable. The convention, though comprising of so many distinguished characters, could not be expected to make a faultless government, and he would prefer trusting to posterity the amendment of its defects rather than to push the experiment too far. So he's talking about right now, he still says, hey, we could just amend the Articles of Confederation still. We don't need to abolish it and start over. People are going to push back. You might be creating too much of a federal government, central government. I'm okay with some, but you're going for too much is what he's saying.
We're pushing up against a line. Don't cross it.
He talks about a faultless government. He understands the nature of men. This is why you hear me rail against Hamilton nonstop. His two big things were federally funded internal improvements and protective tariffs, aka mercantilism or crony capitalism. And I make the case that as soon as you turn the government into a piggy bank, you're going to attract swine. And that's what we've done. The piggy bank just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and you got more and more hands in that cookie jar. And that's how you get a corrupt government that we're living through today.
And understand that mercantilism, which the British were using, is basically using regulations, using law to determine how the economics will work. It's a manipulation of the system by picking winners and losers in the market. And it fails every time in history. We fought against that, but yet what are we becoming? What have we become?
Yeah, it's a cartel-based system, and once they get the regulatory capture, their pet politicians pass laws to raise the barriers of entry, eliminating their competition, and to make sure that only they can play, in these very lucrative fields, which has to do with government handouts.
Which then leads to the rise of lobbyists.
Okay, Mr. Luther Martin. Where's Martin from again? He is from Maryland. He agrees with Colonel Mason as to the importance of the state governments. He would support them at the expense of the general government, which was instituted for the purpose of that support. The only purpose of having the central government or the general government is to support the states, which is an incredibly important point. He saw no necessity for two branches of the legislature. And
he's talking about two houses, right?
And if it existed, Congress might be organized into two. He considered Congress as representing of the people, being chosen by the legislatures who were chosen by the people. At any rate, Congress represented the legislatures, and it was the legislatures, not the people, who refused to enlarge their powers. It's going back what's been going on, and every time the Congress has tried to ask for more power, the legislatures have said, hell no.
And so now understand, folks, so when they're talking about, they represent the legislatures. In other words, the state legislatures are appointing the members. Ultimately, not that I want to fast forward too much. Ultimately, that's what the Senate becomes. The legislatures were appointing, but it was two per state. Then the House becomes the vote of the people. At this point right now, the people don't have a big voice, but you got to remember, history shows that democracy fails. History shows that people are uninformed. History shows people will mess it up. Yet, we know that the people must have a voice. There must be a consent to the governed. How do you allow one without suffering from the other?
Very good. Luther Martin continues. Nor could the rule of voting have been the ground of objection. Otherwise, 10 of the states must always have been ready to place further confidence in Congress. The causes of repugnance must therefore be looked for elsewhere. At the separation from the British Empire, the people of America preferred the establishment of themselves into 13 separate sovereignties instead of incorporating themselves into one. To these they look up for their security of their lives, liberties, and properties, and to these they must look up. He's talking about the states. The federal government they formed to defend the whole against foreign nations in case of war, and to defend the lesser states against the ambition of the larger. It's an important point. They are afraid of granting powers unnecessarily, lest they should defeat the original end of the Union, lest the power should prove dangerous to the sovereignties of the particular states which the Union was meant to support.
You're starting to see this discussion. You're starting to see this discussion of a distribution of power. You're starting to see this. Well, we know the central government needs to have these powers, but we don't want them to have power of the state. So we're starting to see the development of this idea of a distribution of power. Go ahead.
And he's also defining why we formed the federal government, just to defend the whole defense.
Right.
And
to protect, preserve, and promote the Union.
Yeah. Says, and expose the lesser to being swallowed up by the larger, talking about large, small states. Mm-hmm. He conceived also that the people of the states, having already vested their powers in their respective legislatures, could not resume them without a dissolution of their governments. Interesting point. You'd have to dissolve your state legislature to reapportion the powers you gave it to them and give it to a national Congress. And they're not going to do that.
Yeah.
He was against conventions of the states in the states, was not against assisting states against rebellious subjects. Though the federal pain of Mr. Patterson did not require coercion more than the national one, as the latter must depend for the deficiency of its revenues on requisitions and quotas, and their national judiciary extended into the states would be ineffectual and would be viewed with a jealousy inconsistent with its usefulness. Two important points there.
How so?
Yeah, the second one, of course, he's talking about with the federal judiciary needs to stay the heck out of state business. That goes back to the negative of state law. Obviously, they wrote Article 3 with that in mind, and then the judiciary branch decided to ignore it altogether and expand its own power. The other point is he's talking about coercion. Who is going to have that power to collect revenue? The new federal government is reliant upon the states for its allowance. And that's important.
Now, as the government proceeds, once we're established, one of the things they realize too is they don't want a head tax, because historically, taking tax directly from the population opens up this opportunity for there to be no limit on how much the government takes. So they start working on, once again, how do you have one thing without the other? You need revenue. How do you create it, but not take it directly from the people? So, indirect taxation, where the states are paying into the budget, things like tariffs, there's other revenue sources that they develop over time. Go ahead.
All right, speaking next is Mr. Sherman.
Now, and it's spelled correctly this time. Roger Sherman is one of my favorite people in the convention, not because he was always right or not because of necessarily what he said, but I love the fact that he was the firm voice there. He did not put up with anything, and people knew when he said what he said, he meant what he said. But the other thing I liked about Sherman is he was looking for, okay, you've got this idea and this idea. How can we maneuver it to something that works for both sides? He was always the guy that was looking for that. And that's one of the things I love about Roger Sherman, aside from the fact that he's firm. But anyway, go ahead.
Sherman is from Connecticut.
Right, Connecticut.
He seconded and supported Mr. Lansing's previous motion. He admitted two branches to be necessary in the state legislatures, but saw no necessity for them in a confederacy of states.
Interesting. I think we should have two houses, but it's not necessarily a confederacy. What is he saying? Articles of Confederation ain't going to happen anymore.
The examples were all of a single council. Congress carried us through the through the war, and perhaps as well as any government could have done. The complaints at present are not that the views of Congress are unwise or unfaithful, but that their powers are insufficient for the execution of their views. That's pretty much the whole reason we're here.
All right.
The national debt.
He's recognizing also there's a difference between states and centralized systems. The national government or general government and the states, they're going to operate differently because they're doing different things. Again, I think this is a testimony to what would become the distribution of power that eventually goes on. All right, go ahead.
Congress, indeed, by the Confederation,
I thought we were at the top. I thought they were at the very top line there. The national debt and the want of power.
Sorry, I lost myself. Let's find it, and then I'll start the recording again. Where do you want me to be?
Well, I believe that but their powers are insufficient for the execution of their views. The last thing we said. So where it says the fourth line down, the national debt and the want of power.
Okay. Okay, continuing. The national debt and the want of power somewhere to draw forth the national resources are the great matters that press. All states were sensible of the defect of power in Congress. He thought much might be said in apology for the failure of the state legislatures to comply with the Confederation. They were afraid of bearing too hard on the people by accumulating taxes. No constitutional rule had been or could be observed in the quotas. The accounts also were unsettled, and every state supposed itself in advance rather than in arrears. It's talking about taxation and Congress's inability to levy such.
Yeah, which is one of the issues that was drawn in when it came to Shays' Rebellion. You can't tax, so you can't fund a force to put down an insurrection. So we have a weak system.
For want of a general system, taxes to a due amount had not been drawn from trade, which was the most convenient resource.
He's talking tariffs there.
As almost all the states had agreed to the recommendation of Congress on the subject of an impost, it appeared clearly that they were willing to trust Congress with power to draw revenue from trade. Obviously, the Supreme Court's been talking about that in the last week. There is no weight, therefore, in the argument drawn from a distrust of Congress for money matters being the most important of all. If the people will trust them with power as to them, they will trust them with any other necessary powers. Give Congress the power to tax, you may as well give them all the power, right? And this is why it's important about, the recent Supreme Court ruling on Trump's tariffs is it's so important that they're going to debate who has that power to tax.
Well, and understand, the argument, the way it's being presented is who has the power to tax. And that's not really what the argument, if you read the ruling very carefully, it wasn't necessarily who has the power to tax, but who has the power to establish tax. And there is a difference because, see, it is clear that Congress may establish the schedule, but the president has to operate in real time to apply that. And when it comes to, for example, foreign policy, and what they're basically saying is he can execute law, but that law, the IEEPA, did not give him the authority he's saying. Of course, he's drawing from other laws. And historically, when it comes to tariffs, I don't mean to get into a tariff soapbox. This is important because we're talking tariffs right here with these lines. Historically, what they realized over time was tariffs is both a tax and a foreign policy tool. So while Congress would establish the schedule and establish what and how the president do it, it was the president that in real time had to do the negotiations and all that. And so Congresses would typically give the president that leeway. Could you imagine being in negotiation over tariffs and your opposition, other country says, well, we don't like that number. We'll go with this number. All right, hang on. Let me go ask Congress. I'll be back in a few months after they do their committees and figure it out. It would never work. So Congresses gave through legislation presidents the opportunity to do what they needed to do. The IEEPA, the law that was in the recent tariff ruling by the Supreme Court, they're saying it was too broadly interpreted. It did, and this is funny because they want to broadly interpret the Constitution, but it better be expressly enumerated in law. But that's beside the point. But my point is that's what it comes down to. So it wasn't really about tariffs as much as it was, is it given to the president so that he can execute it? It comes down to what does the law say? You hear me always say, what does the Constitution say? In this case, what does the law say? Does the law give him that opportunity based on the law he's using? The RTAA, which was passed in 1932, gives the president broad powers on tariffs. I'm surprised. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I could recite some of the dissenting opinions on that, but we'll do that another day. All right, Congress, indeed, by the Confederation, have in fact the right of saying how much the people shall pay and to what purpose it shall be applied. And this right was
Oh, you
granted.
mean transparency? Sorry, I couldn't help myself.
You usually can't. It's all right. We'll allow it. We'll allow it. And this right was granted them in the expectation that it would, in all cases, have its effect. Now, that's not quite true what they're saying, because they still have, the states can still nullify and say, no, we're not paying that.
Mhm.
If another branch were to be added to Congress to be chosen by the people, it would serve to embarrass. Well, it actually does embarrass us.
Now, why would that be? Let's examine that just for a second. Why would that be? Because they knew that anything that is democratically voted, typically the large population centers would dominate that particular body. And people in the cities tended to be more dependent, tended to want more government involvement, and it would go against what they're trying to establish here. It's a fear of democracy, is what he's saying.
It's not only that, but it's embarrassing when you've got one body of the legislature who answer to the state legislatures, another who answer to the people, and he's worried about them bickering and disagreeing. And you and I would say, we want them to disagree. That's where compromise comes from. So that's the balance we're trying to get to.
Well, and also the one chosen by the people, they might put some yokels in there, and that's kind of embarrassing too. And there might be a little bit of that in that statement too. But anyway, all right, go ahead.
That would never happen. We have nothing but Congress critters of the highest. Never mind. All right, the people would not much interest themselves in the elections. A few designing men in the large districts would carry their points, and the people would have no more confidence in their new representatives than in Congress. He saw no reason why. In fact, that's a point I like to. When I say we should expand the Electoral College, and I'm going to be talking about this nonstop all year. If we ever met for an Article 5 convention, someone needs to propose that, one person, one vote is ridiculous. You set up a system where someone with a bunch of money, or
it allows the factions to control it, right?
Exactly. From national political parties, instead of having local representation.
Mm-hmm.
But if we were to say, okay, every 1,000 people in the neighborhood, say, hey, who's the guy who represents us best, and that'll be our elector and he'll go to the county level and be an elector, and they'll elect an elector there. You still got your say, but we don't have to put up with all the BS of money in politics. So anyway, we'll talk more about that later. I'm in favor of expanding the Electoral College all the way. He saw no reason why the state legislatures should be unfriendly, as had been suggested, to Congress. If they appoint Congress and approve their measures, they would be rather favorable and partial to them. The disparity of the states in point of size, he perceived, was the main difficulty. Here we go again, big states, small states.
Getting back to that faction, right?
But the large states had not yet suffered from the equality of votes enjoyed by the small ones. In all great and general points, the interests of all the states were the same. The state of Virginia, notwithstanding the equality of votes, ratified the Confederation without or even proposing any alteration. Massachusetts, another big state, also ratified without any material difficulty. And none of the ratifications, this is talking about the ratification of the Articles of Confederation right now, and none of the ratifications is the want of two branches noticed or complained of.
Yeah, remember, folks, under the Articles of Confederation, it is a unicameral, single-chamber Congress. And this is why this debate's going back and forth. Almost all the states have bicameral, two-chamber Congresses, but under the Articles, it's a single-chamber Congress. History has shown bicameral being successful, but that unicameral often does okay too. There's a fear of, as I hate to say it this way, but too many chefs in the kitchen. So go ahead.
And it's a fundamental protection. You got to protect the big from the small and the small from the big. And what that means in practical terms is, under the Articles of Confederation, a handful of little tiny states can gang up and push Virginia and Massachusetts around. So Virginia wanted to propose, apportionment that was population based. They had the biggest state, most people. That would allow the big states to push the small states around.
Yeah.
And the compromise they came up with satisfied both.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be one or the other. This gets back to Roger Sherman. This gets back to the distribution of power. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It doesn't have to be, well, if you champion this, you hate that. Well, there's always an integration opportunity when it comes to the distribution of power.
And obviously, between Reynolds v. Sims and the 17th Amendment, we've completely forgotten those lessons, and both of those need to be reversed.
We have been convinced that we are democracy and we got to save our democracy, and democracy always wins, and democracy is the problem. But anyway, go ahead.
As we go through this, tell me if a single one of these people ever says one person, one vote.
Right.
Because that's what the Supreme Court ruled.
Well, they recognized democracy was dangerous. I mean, when Alexis de Tocqueville came here, ultimately wrote his book, Democracy in America, he didn't call it Democracy in America because it was a good thing that was democracy in America. It was a warning. Democracy's bad. Right now, it's working in America because America's good, but we all know democracy's bad. Even the Europeans knew it, but their way to deal with it was to have a king to get rid of the democracy.
Well, it's funny, when Tocqueville was writing that, was I believe Andrew Jackson was the president, and as he was consolidating, and he's consolidating power to the national government.
Well, that's the reason why he was writing it, because Andrew Jackson was all about democracy. Democracy was the beginning of the Democratic Party, but democracy is the road to collectivism, ultimately, because the large population areas rule the vote.
It says, okay, who's talking again? Mr. Sherman's still talking.
Mm-hmm. He is long-winded, by the way. Firm, but long-winded.
Am I right here? To consolidate the states, as some have proposed, would dissolve our treaties with foreign nations, which had been formed with us as confederated states. It's a bit of a problem. You have to go back and redo 13. He did not, however, suppose that the creation of the two branches in the legislature would have such an effect. If the difficulty on the subject of representation cannot be otherwise got over, he would agree to have two branches and a proportional representation in one of them. So he's now saying, I'll agree with this compromise, provided each state had an equal voice in the other.
Aha, boy, that sounds familiar, don't it, folks? He's talking your House and your Senate the way it is. Two per state for the voice of the states, equal voice, and then proportional for the voice of the people.
Exactly. This was necessary to secure the rights of the lesser states. Otherwise, 3 or 4 of the large states would rule the others as they please, sort of like what's going on today with California and New York.
Yeah, so the states with larger populations would have their voice in the House. The rural states would have their voice in the Senate.
And it would have stayed that way, except for we nationalized the political party system, and now your state senator, the U.S. senator from your state, doesn't represent you. They represent an entity in Washington, D.C. Each state, like each individual, had its peculiar habits, usages, and manners, which constituted its happiness. It would not, therefore, give to others a power over this happiness, any more than an individual would do when he could avoid it. States can keep their own personalities. Mr. Wilson urged the necessity of two branches, observed that if a proper model were not to be found in the confederacies, it was not to be wondered at. The number of them was small, and the duration of some at least short. Talking about previous confederacies throughout history.
Mm-hmm.
We had to look this up before. The Amphictyonic and Achaean were formed in the infancy of political science and appear by their history and fate to have contained radical defects. The Swiss and Belgic confederacies were held together not by any vital principle of energy, but by the incumbent pressure of formidable neighboring nations. The German owed its continuance to the influence of the House of Austria. I think he's saying House of Austria. He appealed to our own experience for the defects of our confederacy. He appealed. He had been 6 years in the 12 since the commencement of the Revolution a member of Congress, and had felt all its weaknesses. He appealed to the recollection of others whether on many important occasions the public interest had not been obstructed by the small members of the Union. It's basically saying, what have we done wrong? What have we done right? The success of the Revolution was owing to other causes than the Constitution of Congress. In many instances, it went on even against the difficulties arising from Congress themselves. Part of what he's referring to is during the Revolutionary War itself, the Continental Congress already has been assembled. They're struggling to be a remotely effective body, and yet he's saying the revolution was able to continue. They were run by a bunch of state militias under the banner of Washington. Congress itself, most of the time camping out in Philadelphia, is more of a stumbling block than they are any kind of assistance. When the war ends, that kind of didn't change a whole lot. He admitted that the large states did accede, as had been stated, to the Confederation in its present form, but it was the effect of necessity, not of choice. So the big states took the Articles of Confederation because if we don't sign it, we're going to be 13 scattered states. We need to do this.
Well, and remember early on, too, when it came to the Articles of Confederation, it took a while to get it ratified because of smaller states, because they were complaining that the larger states were in position to become even larger with the Northwest Territory. We're not signing it unless you break that territory up into something smaller for new states. We don't want a Virginia that goes from coast to coast.
There were other instances of their yielding from the same motive to the unreasonable measures of the small states. The situation of things is now a little altered. He insisted that a jealousy would exist between the state legislatures and the general legislature, observing that the members of the former would have views and feelings very distinct in this respect from their constituents. A private citizen of a state is indifferent whether power be exercised by the general or state legislatures, provided it be exercised most for his happiness. His representative has an interest in its being exercised by the body to which he belongs. Talking about power. He will therefore view the national legislature with an eye of a jealous rival. He observed that the address of Congress to the people at large had always been better received and produced greater effect than those made to legislatures. And I would argue that we want a state legislature to jealously guard their fiefdoms.
Sure. And that gets back to the Saxons. You had your family, you had your community, you had your county, you had your general government, and local issues, local government. And why would you want a distant office deciding for you how you're going to plant crops or where your road's going to be or whatever?
He's also making the point that, you don't have these problems with power-hungry people in the national legislature. Yeah, I think you missed on that one, buddy. All right, a couple votes. A vote comes up on the question for postponing in order to take up Mr. Lansing's proposition to vest the powers of legislation in Congress. The noes carried it. On the motion of deputies from Delaware, the question of the Second Revolution in the report of the Committee of the Whole was postponed till tomorrow. And we've got time to jump into tomorrow. Here we are on Thursday, June 21st, 1787. Madison's debates. Dr. Johnson, and Johnson is that William Samuel Johnson, Doug?
I'm not sure, to be honest with you.
That's the only Johnson I have on the roster, so we're going to assume that's who it is. William Samuel Johnson, also from Connecticut.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about Johnson because when it comes to Connecticut, Sherman was such a loud voice, everybody else kind of faded into the background. So I don't know a lot about Johnson.
Yeah, Ellsworth has had his moments too, so I'm not going to call him. Yeah, Connecticut was a loud state at the time. Fair enough.
Good reason to be. We're wedged between, New York and Massachusetts. and Pennsylvania. But anyway, go ahead.
On a comparison of the two plans which were proposed by Virginia and New Jersey, it appeared that the peculiarity which characterized the latter, that's the New Jersey plan, was its being calculated to preserve the individuality of the states. Good. The plan for Virginia did not profess to destroy this individuality altogether, but was charged with such a tendency. One gentleman alone, Colonel Hamilton, in his animadversions on the plan of New Jersey, boldly and decisively contended for an abolition of the state governments, which Hamilton wants to get rid of the states.
He wants to be nothing more than provinces.
Mr. Wilson and the gentleman for Virginia also were adversaries of the plan of New Jersey, held a different language. They wished to leave the states in possession of a considerable, though a subordinate, jurisdiction. They had not yet, however, shown how this could consist with or be secured against the general sovereignty and jurisdiction which they proposed to give to the national government. How are you going to maintain this separation of powers? You haven't demonstrated it yet. If this could be shown in such a manner as to satisfy the patrons of the New Jersey propositions that the individuality of the states would not yet be endangered, many of their objections would no doubt be removed. It's important what he's saying. All right, Virginia, we've got these two balancing plans. How are you going to maintain state sovereignty and grant powers to this general government? It has not been articulated well enough yet, is what Johnson's saying. If this could not be shown, their objections would have their full force. If they can't show that. He wished it, therefore, to be well considered whether in the case the states, as was proposed, should retain some portion of sovereignty at least. This portion could be preserved without allowing them to participate effectually in the general government, without giving them each a distinct and equal vote for the purpose of defending themselves in the general councils.
You're seeing the beginnings of what would become the Great Compromise, the Connecticut Compromise. Go ahead.
Mr. Wilson, once again, that's James Wilson, Pennsylvania. His respect for Dr. Johnson, added to the importance of the subject, led him to attempt, unprepared as he was, to solve the difficulty which had been started. It was asked how the general government and individuality of the particular states could be reconciled to each other, and how the latter could be secured against the former. Might it not, on the other side, be asked how the former was to be secured against the latter? We're saying, how are you going to protect, not only how do you protect the general government from the states, but how are you going to protect the states from the general government?
Mm-hmm.
It was generally admitted that a jealousy and rivalship would be felt between the general and particular governments. As the plan now stood, though indeed contrary to his opinion, one branch of the general government, the Senate, or second branch, was to be appointed by the state legislatures. The state legislatures, therefore, by this participation in the general government, would have an opportunity of defending their rights.
Hence, there not being that jealousy.
Yeah, and it also kind of alludes to the ability to recall your senator if they don't do what the legislature wants.
Now, what he's talking about here is this idea that there should be oversight by the states. If there's going to be a general government and they fear it, what better way to alleviate their fears if they have oversight? In other words, in a sense, that general government has to ask the state's permission before it does anything. Ultimately, that's essentially what happens with the Senate. The Senate becomes the voice of the states, and so the states are now involved with all the legislation. The states, through the Senate, not only is involved in legislation, but then ratifies treaties, confirms appointees. The states have a hand in what's going on, and the federal government's not operating without making sure it's okay with the state's representatives, the senators. This is what he's talking about. Is this what we want? Will the states be happy if they have a hand in what's going on?
And there would have been, and that's why the 17th Amendment is so offensive, because it completely stripped the states from having any say in it. And we are now basically run by one capital.
We are basically Hamilton's America, the provinces.
We are not the United States. We are not the United States of America. We are the state of America. Ought not a reciprocal opportunity be given to the general government of defending itself by having an appointment of some one constituent branch of the state governments? What's he saying there? The general government put their people in the states?
If you do one, then should you do the other?
If a security to be necessary on one side, it would seem reasonable to demand it of the other. It's a terrible point he's making.
Right. Well, you got to remember, Wilson is from Pennsylvania, and he's a little bit of a Hamiltonian. I mean, not as bad as Hamilton, but he leans in Hamilton's direction. He's basically saying, how can the federal government operate if the states have their voice in there? Because they might start dictating to it to do things that isn't within what the whole point of having a general government is for.
His resolution of that it doesn't seem very practicable. The other thing Wilson likes to do is throw stuff at the wall to see what sticks. He's one of those. I think that's what he's doing here. But taking the matter in a more general view, he saw no danger to the states from the general government. In case a combination should be made by the large ones, it would produce a general alarm among the rest, and the project would be frustrated.
So in other words, if the federal government became a problem, the larger states would ain't happening, and it would stop. So it's no danger there. But the states could be a danger to the federal government. That's what he's essentially saying.
But there was no temptation to such a project. The states having in general a similar interest in case of any proposition in the national legislature to encroach on the state legislatures, he conceived a general alarm would take place in the national legislature itself, that it would communicate itself to the state legislatures, and would finally spread among the people at large. If there's encroachment, it'll self-correct, is what he's saying. The general government will be as ready to preserve the rights of the states as the latter are to preserve the rights of individuals.
He doesn't seem to remember the British Empire real well, does he?
Benign government. All the members of the former having a common interest as representatives of all the people of the latter to leave the state governments in possession of what the people wish them to retain. It's a lot of naivety. He could not discover, therefore, any danger whatever on the side from which it had been apprehended. On the contrary, he conceived that in spite of every precaution, the national government would be in perpetual danger of encroachments from the state governments.
He's arguing against a check against the federal government by the states.
Yeah, he's worried that the states would dominate the national government, whereas people like George Mason are arguing the opposite.
Right. But once again, remember, Wilson comes from a very large population state, and he becomes, matter of fact, a member of the Federalist Party once Hamilton forms that. So just be aware.
We got time to do a long paragraph on Madison, I think.
Okay.
All right, James Madison speaks next, writing about himself in the third person. Mr. Madison was of the opinion that there was one, less danger of encroachment from the general government than from the state governments, and two, that the mischief from encroachments would be less fatal if made by the former than if made by the latter. The former being the general government, the latter being the state governments. Madison is agreeing that the states are the biggest danger.
Now remember, Madison went into this convention as a nationalist. He went in believing that the new national legislature should be able to negative state laws if they weren't good for the country or considered constitutional. He's going through a metamorphosis, but he's still leaning in a Hamiltonian manner at this point. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's so important to pause there. It really shows where he's coming from at this point in time.
Mm-hmm.
All the examples of other confederacies prove the greater tendency in such system to anarchy than to tyranny. to a disobedience of the members than to usurpations of the federal head. Our own experience had fully illustrated this tendency, but it will be said that the proposed change in the principles and form of the Union will vary the tendency that the general government will have real and greater powers, and will be derived in one branch, at least from the people, not from the governments of the states. He's saying, yes, this new general government is going to be more powerful. To give full force to this objection, let it be supposed for a moment that indefinite power should be given to the general legislature and the states reduced to corporations dependent on the general legislature. Why should it follow that the general government would take from the states any branch of their power as far as its operation was beneficial, and its continuance desirable to the people? Pause there. What's he saying, Doug?
Well, he's kind of getting back to Wilson. He's like, hey, why the general government, we're giving it what it needs. Why would it take anything from the states?
Why indeed?
Unless it benefits them. And if it benefits the general government, then it's a good thing, right?
And obviously, therefore, it's desirable to the people.
And understand, he's operating from a mindset that they're all honorable and that they would remain honorable as they move forward. He hasn't caught the George Mason disease of understanding human nature yet.
That's a good way of putting it. In some of the states, particularly in Connecticut, all the townships are incorporated and have a certain limited jurisdiction. Have the representatives of the people of the townships in the legislature of the state ever endeavored to despoil the townships or any part of their local authority? As far as this local authority is convenient to the people, they are attached to it, and their representatives chosen by and amenable to them naturally respect their attachment to this, as much as their attachment to any other right or interest. And the point's valid. On a small scale, this type of loose Republican form of government works really, really well.
Yes and no. Again, human nature, even at the small level, can be a problem. I love it when people say, well, Doug, if our representatives at the federal level just represented less people, they would listen more to the people. And says, really? Then how do you explain city council members being so out of whack?
And there's a counter to that right here in New Hampshire in the Free State Project. New Hampshire has got more representatives per person than any other state. And the reps here on the state level actually listen to local people. We actually have a voice more than any place I've ever lived. So there's an argument to both sides of this. We actually have, like I said, the best ratio.
Yeah, and that debate went on back then. Remember, one of the amendments of the Bill of Rights was kind of about that. But anyway, go ahead.
The First Amendment.
Yeah.
The original first. The
only one that never got ratified of the 12 that went out to the states.
The 27th Amendment being the 11th, right?
Well, it was the second. But yeah, the 11th. Yeah, I know what you mean. The 11th of the 10.
Got it.
But it was the second of the original. So yes, because you had 10 when the Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791. Gotcha.
And how many went out first? It was like 180 something.
Well, yeah. That's what came from the states, and then they organized it. And they're like, okay, that's repetitious. That's ridiculous. That's repetitious. And they got it down to. I'm trying to remember. They finally got down to 14 that finally was proposed to Congress. And then Congress got it down to 12. And then 12 went out to the states, and then 10 came back ratified. But 18 at one point, and then it got reduced to 14, and then it got reduced to 12. But anyway, yeah, there was well over 100 amendments requested by the states. But like I said, a lot of them were repetitious. A lot of them were things that weren't necessarily reasonable. So.
And the whole time Hamilton thinks the Bill of Rights is redundant in the first place.
Well, and in many ways it is.
And that's, yeah, we can have that argument. But that definitely is, I mean, I'll take either side of that and have fun.
Well, Madison believed it was redundant, but then wound up becoming its greatest defender in the House. So he's kind of an interesting sort on that, too. But anyway, go ahead.
The relation of a general government to state governments is parallel. Guards were more necessary against encroachments of the state governments on the general government than of the latter on the former. History has shown us differently, obviously.
Right. And once again, at this point, he's still kind of got a nationalist mindset.
The great objection made against an abolition of state governments was that the general government could not extend its care to all the minute objects which fall under the cognizance of the local jurisdiction. Amen to that. Federal government should stick to its lane and let most things should be handled locally. The objection, as stated, lay not against the probable abuse of the general power, but against the imperfect use that could be made of it throughout so great an extent of country, and over so great a variety of objects. And that's exactly the right argument. Central planning doesn't work. Things that work in Iowa don't work in California. One size fits all does not work on humanity. That's probably one of the best arguments for federalism.
Mm-hmm.
As far as its operation would be practicable, it could not, in this view, be improper. As far as it would be impracticable, the conveniency of the general government itself would concur with that of the people in the maintenance of subordinate governments. Were it practicable for the general government to extend its care to every requisite object without the cooperation of the state governments, the people would not be less free as members of one great republic than as members of 13 small ones. What do you think about that, Doug? That statement?
Yeah.
And that's one of the problems with nationalism. We're all happy the United States won a gold medal in hockey, and we're all USA, USA. But back then, you were a citizen of your state, and that's who you had proud of. You took pride in your state. You weren't, you liked the fact that you were part of a union with your rival states, but it wasn't one national government, one national identity. And that was done to us on purpose as the national government seized more and more power. They started to indoctrinate us with that belief. Like I said, it's not the United States of America anymore. It is the state of America.
Well, you saw yourself as a Virginian or a Pennsylvanian before you saw yourself as an American. And while the term American did exist, it wasn't being widely used yet, per se.
A citizen of Delaware was not more free than a citizen of Virginia, nor would either be more free than a citizen of America. History is shown differently. Supposing, therefore, a tendency in the general government to absorb the state governments, no fatal consequence could result. Madison, you got that wrong. Taking the reverse, the supposition that a tendency should be left to the state governments towards an independence on the general government, and the gloomy consequences need to be pointed out. The imagination of them must have suggested to the states the experiment we are now making to prevent the calamity, and must have formed the chief motive with those present to undertake the arduous task. On the question for resolving, okay, let's talk about what we said before we got to the question. He's saying the states have proven their inability to govern independently, and that's why we're here in the first place. He is overshooting the mark here.
He's also recognizing, though, that what they're creating is something that is very different than anything that's ever been tried before. He uses the word experiment, which kind of gives us that feel.
Wish we'd go back to that. On the question for resolving that the legislature ought to consist of two branches, once again, aye, nay, aye, nay, divided in Maryland, and aye in Virginia, aye in North Carolina, aye in South Carolina, and Georgia votes aye. The ayes have it. We have two branches of the legislature.
Yeah, but here's something that's fascinating. Notice the southern states were all for it. Connecticut was all for it. The rest of the northern, not so much.
And New York, New Jersey, and Delaware were all no's.
And of course, Maryland divided. Well, they're that midpoint between the northern and the southern states. The southern states have always had an attitude of, we want our say, we want checks and balances, and leave us the hell alone.
that is probably a really good place to take a break until our next show.
Okay.
Yeah, we got a good hour and 15 in with a small little break. Yeah, that's really good. They talked. I mean, these are some really fundamental issues. We can see the nationalists, sitting there trying to protect the federal government from those mean old states.
Right.
And we've got the advantage of hindsight. We can look back and it was just the opposite. They should have been much more concerned about preserving state sovereignty. We'll pick up on the third resolution sometime next week. Hopefully, we can start getting to a routine of doing more than one show a week. Now that we're all healthy and not limping around. But,
well, there is that, but there's also, it depends on the days too, because, and I'm serious here. I have plenty of time to do stuff like this when it's raining because I can't go outside. And when it's not raining, I got to take advantage of that, man. I'm splitting wood. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. So it is kind of funny because it is a different lifestyle here. But so I guess it depends on the weather. But no, I enjoyed this. I'm glad we're back on the air. And it's funny because normally when we schedule these, I'm up maybe 30 minutes beforehand. I was up like 2 hours before this. I was working on stuff, but definitely enjoyed it. Thank you for another episode, Warhamster and audience, and we're looking forward to seeing you next time.
Yeah, real quick, Doug, you want to tell people I haven't seen you in a while, make sure everyone knows how to find you?
DouglasVGibbs.com. I am writing pretty much daily. I just wrote last night, late last night, an article because my wife asked me a question, and you get to be the recipient of this. What is a redistribution of wealth? And so I wrote about it. So my wife just finished reading The Naked Communist. Now she's reading The 5,000-Year Leap. She's got the Cleon Skousen thing going right now. You can also find me at navigation2liberty.com, navigation, the number 2, liberty.com. That site is a good place to go to if you're looking for a list of my books, how to find my radio shows and other programs with specific links, because it's just not working right at douglasvgibbs.com right now. So navigation, the number 2, liberty.com, navigation to liberty.com. And we are looking at some big changes. I have an advertiser for my AM radio show at KMET retiring in July. There is a big likelihood that that show will change, will go from AM radio to Rumble. The San Diego show, my main advertiser has been hit with some stuff when it comes to certain things, so I have less coming in. Now, if you want to keep me on AM radio, there's a way to help. You just go to either one of the websites, you donate, or you can become a $9 a month member. Just hit join or join the movement, depending on which site you're on. DouglasVGibbs.com, navigation to liberty.com, navigation, the number 2, liberty.com.
Very good. Doug, we will talk next week. Have yourself a great weekend. Thanks, everybody, for watching. Until next time, cheers.